At exactly midnight on her 18th birthday, Iris's childhood home was padlocked by the county sheriff. Shivering in the freezing Oregon rain, with just $34 in her pocket, her only inheritance was the title to a rotting 1973 school bus. She thought it was a cruel joke. In reality, it was a multi-million-dollar lifeline. The foreclosure notice on the front door of 442 Sycamore Drive was printed on bright, neon orange paper. To Iris Jenkins, it felt like a flashing neon sign broadcasting her ultimate failure to the entire neighborhood. For 3 years, Iris had watched her mother fade away from early-onset Parkinson's, and for 3 years, she had watched the medical bills devour everything they owned. The savings accounts went first, then the college fund, and finally the equity in the modest ranch house they had called home. When her mother passed away just 2 weeks before Iris's 18th birthday, the grace period ended. Pacific Continental Bank didn't care about mourning periods. They cared about the missed mortgage payments. On a brutally cold Tuesday evening in November, Deputy Miller stood on the porch, his face tight with forced sympathy. "I'm sorry, Iris. You're legally an adult now, and the property is bank-owned as of midnight. You have to step off the premises." Iris pulled the collar of her worn Carhartt jacket up to her chin, clutching a single black garbage bag containing a few changes of clothes, her mother's wedding ring, and a manila envelope left behind by her late grandfather, James Higgins. She stepped onto the wet sidewalk. She had no relatives to call. The foster care system had officially washed its hands of her, and the homeless shelters in downtown Portland were at maximum capacity due to the unseasonable freeze. She opened the damp manila envelope under the flickering glow of a street lamp. Inside was a single piece of paper, the title to a 1973 Bluebird school bus. James Higgins had been an eccentric, reclusive mechanic who died a few years prior, leaving behind a reputation for being paranoid and penniless. He had spent the last decade of his life living out of that rusted yellow bus, parking it on the edge of a scrap yard owned by his only friend. Iris remembered visiting him once when she was 10. The bus smelled of stale tobacco, motor oil, and wet dog. Now it was the only piece of property in the world with her name on it. With no other options, Iris began the 4-mile trek to Henderson's Auto Salvage on the industrial outskirts of town. The rain turned into a biting sleet by the time she reached the chain-link gates of the scrapyard. A gruff, elderly man with a thick grey beard stepped out of the guard shack, shining a heavy maglite directly into her face. "We're closed," Bill Henderson barked. Then, lowering the beam, his expression softened. "Iris? Artie's granddaughter? Good Lord, girl, what are you doing out in this weather?" Tears mixed with the freezing rain on Iris's cheeks. "The bank took the house, Mr. Henderson. I don't have anywhere to go. Is my grandpa's bus still here?" Bill let out a heavy sigh, unlocking the gate. "It's still exactly where he left it in the back lot. Hasn't moved an inch in 4 years. It ain't much of a home, kid, but it's got a roof. Come on." He led her through rows of wrecked cars to the far corner of the junkyard, beside a line of towering pines. An old bus sat there, its peeling paint exposing thick rust, its flat tires buried in the mud beneath a layer of moss. Bill forced the accordion doors open with a harsh screech. Inside, the stale air reeked of mildew. Most of the seats had been removed years ago by James, leaving space for a simple bed, a small wood stove, and a row of decaying plywood cabinets. "I'll bring you some blankets from the office," Bill said gently. "Lock the door from the inside." That night, Iris wrapped herself in 3 heavy wool blankets, shivering uncontrollably on the bare mattress. She listened to the rain drumming against the metal roof, wondering how her life had crumbled to this exact point. She was 18, completely alone, and sleeping in a scrap yard. She woke up the next morning to the sound of heavy fists pounding on the side of the bus. Iris scrambled up, her heart hammering against her ribs. She cracked open the foggy window. Standing outside in the mud was a man she had never seen before. He wore a sharp, albeit cheap, grey suit that looked entirely out of place in an auto salvage yard. His dark hair was slicked back, and his eyes darted around with nervous, predatory energy. "Hello in there," the man shouted. "I know someone's in there. Bill up front told me." Iris unlocked the door and pushed it open just enough to peer out. "Who are you?" "Thomas Gable," the man said, flashing a wide, utterly insincere smile. He handed her a business card that read, "Gable Asset Recovery." "I'm a local buyer. I specialize in purchasing abandoned vehicles and scrap metal. I understand you're the new legal owner of this vintage piece of machinery." "It's not for sale," Iris said, her voice raspy from the cold. "Now let's not be hasty," Thomas said, stepping closer, his expensive leather shoes sinking into the muck. "I know your situation, Iris. It's tragic about your mother. Truly. And I know you're flat broke. This bus is an eyesore. It doesn't run, the frame is compromised by rust, and it's practically a biohazard. I'm willing to do you a massive favor. I'll give you $500, cash, right now, just to take the title off your hands." He pulled out a thick wad of bills, peeling off 5 crisp $100 notes. Iris stared at the money. $500 meant hot meals. It meant a week or two in a cheap motel where the heat actually worked. Her stomach gave a violent, painful rumble at the mere thought of a warm diner breakfast. She reached her hand out, but as her fingers brushed the edge of the cash, she looked into Thomas Gable's eyes. They were intensely focused, almost hungry. He was sweating despite the morning chill. Why is he so eager? Iris thought. Why did a suit come all the way out to a muddy scrapyard at 8 in the morning for a worthless, rusted shell of a bus? James Higgins had been paranoid, but he was also brilliant. He held patents for engine parts in the 1980s before he suffered a nervous breakdown and withdrew from society. He could have lived in an apartment, but he chose this bus. He chose to park it in a heavily guarded salvage yard. "No," Iris said, pulling her hand back. "It's not for sale." Thomas's smile instantly vanished, replaced by a cold, hard glare. "Don't be stupid, little girl. You're sleeping in a metal coffin. Take the money." "I said no. Get off my property." Iris slammed the door shut, locking it quickly. She watched through the window as Thomas Gable stood in the mud for a long moment, staring at the bus with a terrifying intensity, before turning and storming away. Iris leaned against the cold metal door, breathing heavily. She had just turned down her only chance at a hot meal, but her gut screamed that she had made the right choice. There was more to this rotting bus than met the eye. For the next 3 days, Iris focused entirely on survival and sanitation. Bill Henderson allowed her to use the scrapyard's employee restroom and shared half of his daily packed lunches with her, slipping her thermos cups of hot black coffee and ham sandwiches. In return, Iris began cleaning the bus. If she was going to live here, she needed to strip away the decades of grime. She found a bucket, some heavy-duty degreaser, and a wire brush in her grandfather's old tool cabinets. As she cleaned, Iris noticed James's unusual modifications. The windows were reinforced with shatterproof Lexan, and beneath the faded wood paneling, thick steel plating lined the walls. He hadn't been living in an ordinary bus. It was built like a fortress. On the fourth afternoon, after the rain finally stopped, she knelt at the back of the bus, scrubbing years of oil and dirt from the rubber floor near the rear axle. As she pushed the wire brush against the floorboards, she hit a snag. She wiped away the dark sludge with a rag. The rubber flooring had been meticulously cut into a 2-foot square. At the corners were 4 heavy steel rivets. 3 of them were standard, but the 4th looked different. It had a tiny, almost invisible crosshair etched into the center. Iris grabbed a flathead screwdriver from the cabinet and wedged it beneath the odd rivet. To her surprise, it didn't pry up. Instead, it turned. It wasn't a rivet at all. It was a recessed, custom-machined locking bolt. She twisted the screwdriver counterclockwise. Click, click, clack. The metal square suddenly popped up 1/2 inch. Iris wedged her fingers underneath the heavy steel-reinforced panel and hauled it backward. Dust plumed into the air. Beneath the floorboard, resting in a hollowed-out cavity between the chassis rails, was an olive-green, military-grade steel lockbox. It was heavy, sealed with a thick brass padlock. Iris's hands shook as she hauled it out onto the mattress. She didn't have the key for the padlock, but she did have an 18-inch steel crowbar she had found in the scrapyard. Setting the box on the floor, she wedged the crowbar through the shackle of the padlock and threw her entire body weight onto the steel bar. With a violent crack, the rusted brass snapped. She threw the lid open, half expecting to find stacks of cash or gold bars. Instead, the box contained 3 items, carefully wrapped in oilcloth to protect them from moisture. The first was a heavy leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed and brittle. The second was a large, hand-drawn architectural blueprint. The third was a heavy, ornate brass key, roughly 4 inches long, with the words First National, Section 402, stamped deeply into the metal. Iris opened the journal. The handwriting was erratic, jumping between neat, precise engineering measurements and chaotic, scrawled rants. August 14th, 1998. They think the City Council bought the rights to the downtown sector, but they didn't read the original 1922 zoning charters. The subterranean rights below the old First National building still belong to the private holding company. My holding company. Gable's father tried to buy me out, tried to force my hand. He doesn't realize what's actually down there. It's not just safe deposit boxes. It's the legacy. Iris frowned, tracing the words with her finger. Gable. Thomas Gable's father. She unfolded the blueprint. It was a schematic of the downtown Oakhaven district, but it looked wrong. It wasn't mapping the streets. It was mapping the underground utility tunnels, the old Prohibition-era bootlegging corridors, and the basement levels of the historic First National Bank building, which had been permanently closed and sealed in the early 2000s. A red X was marked deep beneath the bank's primary vault, labeled with the number 402. Her grandfather hadn't lost his mind. He had been hiding a massive secret right under the town's nose. Suddenly, her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a text from Bill Henderson. "Hey kid, I stepped out to grab parts. Lock the gate if you leave." Back in an hour. Iris looked at the journal and the key. She needed to know more about the First National Bank. The local public library had historical archives on microfilm. If she hurried, she could research the zoning charters James mentioned and make it back before dark. She hastily shoved the journal, the blueprint, and the brass key into her worn canvas backpack. She slid the heavy steel floorboard back into place, locking the fake rivet, and pushed the empty military lockbox under the mattress. She locked the bus door tightly behind her and walked the 2 miles to the Oakhaven Public Library. For 3 hours, Iris sat in the dimly lit basement of the library, scrolling through miles of microfilm from the late 1990s. She uncovered articles about a massive legal dispute between James Higgins and a local real estate conglomerate named Gable and Sons Developments. Gable and Rawls had purchased the defunct First National Bank building, intending to demolish it and build luxury condos. But James had filed injunction after injunction, claiming ownership of the subterranean vault rights. The legal battle had bankrupted him. It was what drove him to live in the bus. But right before the final court ruling, James's holding company abruptly vanished from public record, and the demolition was inexplicably halted. The bank building was left abandoned, standing like a concrete tomb in the center of town. Iris's pulse raced. Her grandfather had won. He had secured whatever was in Vault 402, and he had hidden the only key to access it inside his bus. And now, Thomas Gable was trying to finish what his father started. Realizing it was past sunset, Iris packed her bag and hurried back into the freezing night. The walk back to the salvage yard felt 10 times longer. Shadows stretched across the industrial road, and every passing car made her flinch. When she finally reached Henderson's salvage, she saw something that made her blood run cold. The heavy chain-link gate at the front, which she had meticulously padlocked, had been violently snipped with heavy bolt cutters. The chain hung limply against the fence. Panic seized her chest. She sprinted through the dark maze of crushed cars, ignoring the jagged metal that tore at her jeans. She rounded the corner to her grandfather's bus and let out a horrified gasp. The reinforced Lexan windows had held up, but the front accordion door had been completely torn off its hinges, likely ripped open by a truck winch. Iris drew a heavy breath and stepped inside. The interior was completely destroyed. The mattress was slashed to ribbons, the stuffing scattered like snow. The plywood cabinets had been smashed into splinters with a sledgehammer. Every inch of the bus had been brutally, desperately searched. They had found the hidden compartment. The floorboard was thrown aside, and the empty military lockbox had been dragged out and left open on the floor. "Looking for something, Iris?" Iris spun around. Stepping out from the shadows of a crushed Ford pickup was Thomas Gable, flanked by 2 large men in dark jackets holding heavy flashlights. Gable was no longer smiling. His face was twisted in a mask of pure rage. He stepped into the doorway of the ruined bus, looking down at the empty lockbox. "My father spent 20 years looking for the deed and the key," Gable hissed, his eyes locking onto Iris's canvas backpack. "You're going to hand over whatever you found in that box, little girl. Right now." Iris's heart slammed against her ribs like a trapped bird. She took a slow step backward into the shadows of the rusted bus. Thomas Gable's 2 hired thugs mirrored her movement, stepping forward, their heavy boots crushing the debris of her grandfather's destroyed life. "I don't have anything," Iris lied, her voice trembling. "The box was empty when I found it." Gable let out a sharp, cruel laugh. James Higgins was a paranoid lunatic, but he wasn't a fool. He wouldn't hide an empty box under a 1/4-inch steel plate. "Give me the bag, Iris. Don't make this harder than it has to be." He reached inside his tailored jacket, and the metallic glint of a handgun caught the pale moonlight. Before Gable could draw the weapon, the deafening blast of an air horn shattered the silence. A pair of blinding halogen-high beams flooded the scrapyard aisle. Bill Henderson's massive rusted flatbed tow truck roared around the corner of crushed sedans, its engine screaming. Bill slammed on the brakes, sending a wave of freezing mud splattering directly onto Gable and his men. "Hey!" Bill roared out the driver's window, racking a pump-action shotgun with a terrifying mechanical clack. back away from the kid, or I'm painting this scrap pile with your brains." Gable shielded his eyes from the headlights, cursing loudly as his men instinctively ducked behind a pile of twisted axles. "Run, Iris! Go!" Bill shouted. Iris didn't hesitate. She threw her body weight backward, diving through the shattered emergency exit window at the rear of the bus. She hit the muddy ground hard, ignoring the sharp sting of scraped palms, and scrambled to her feet. She sprinted blindly into the labyrinth of stacked, crushed cars, her canvas backpack secured tightly against her shoulders. She could hear Gable screaming orders at his men over the roaring engine of the tow truck, but she didn't look back. She vaulted over the rusted chain-link fence at the rear of the yard, tearing her jeans on the barbed wire, and dropped into the dense brush of the bordering woods. The freezing rain began to fall again, masking her footsteps as she ran. She didn't stop until her lungs burned, and the metallic taste of blood coated the back of her throat. Leaning against a damp oak tree, she pulled the blueprint from her bag, shielding it from the rain with her jacket. Her grandfather's journal was clear. Thomas Gable's father had tried to steal the subterranean rights to the First National Bank decades ago, and now Thomas was desperate to finish the job. If Gable knew the box was found, he would immediately head to the bank to intercept her. She had to get to Vault 402 tonight. It was the only way to secure whatever James had died protecting. According to the hand-drawn schematic, the entrance wasn't through the bank's boarded-up street-level doors. It was accessible through the city's forgotten steam tunnel network, specifically an old Prohibition-era maintenance hatch located behind a condemned textile mill on Fifth Avenue. It took Iris an hour to navigate the dark, rain-slicked streets of downtown Oakhaven. The textile mill was a looming, blackened brick monstrosity, scheduled for demolition by none other than Gable and Sons Developments. Slipping through a gap in the construction fence, Iris found a heavy iron grate hidden beneath rotting pallets. She struggled to lift it, and a wave of stale, damp air rose from below. Switching on a small penlight, she climbed down the rusty ladder into the darkness. Following her grandfather's carefully drawn map, she navigated the maze of utility tunnels, turned left at a faded yellow stripe, and counted 200 paces down a narrow corridor that sloped deep underground. The deeper she went, the colder it became. Finally, the brick tunnel opened into a gaunt, concrete-lined chamber. At the far end stood a massive, reinforced steel security door. Stenciled across the flaking grey paint were the words, "First National Holdings, Subterranean Level." The electronic keypad on the wall had been smashed years ago, wires hanging loosely from the masonry. But James's blueprint pointed to a small, secondary mechanical override box hidden behind a loose cinder block near the floor. Iris dropped to her knees, found the loose block, and pulled it free. Inside was a heavy manual lever coated in thick grease. She gripped it with both hands and pulled down with all her might. Deep within the concrete, heavy mechanical gears groaned to life. The massive steel door shuddered, crying out with decades of rust, and slowly swung outward by just a few inches. Iris squeezed through the gap. She stood inside the legendary vault of the First National Bank. Her penlight cut through the absolute darkness, illuminating hundreds of brass safety deposit boxes lining the walls from floor to ceiling. The air here was bone dry and perfectly preserved. She walked down the central aisle, her wet sneakers squeaking loudly against the pristine marble floor. She scanned the brass plates. 100, 250, 380. She stopped at the very end of the furthest row. There it was, a large, double-wide deposit door secured by a heavy, archaic lock mechanism. Above it, etched into the brass, was the number 402. With shaking hands, Iris unzipped her damp canvas backpack and pulled out the ornate 4-inch brass key she had found beneath the floorboards of the bus. She slid it into the heavy lock. It fit perfectly. She took a deep breath, praying her grandfather hadn't sent her on a wild goose chase, and turned the key. Click. The heavy internal tumblers fell into place with a deeply satisfying metallic thud. Iris grasped the brass handle and pulled. The heavy door swung open, revealing a long, dark steel drawer. She grabbed the sides and hauled it out onto the marble inspection table in the center of the aisle. The box wasn't filled with stacks of cash or shiny gold bars. Instead, it contained 3 large, heavy, wax-sealed leather envelopes, perfectly preserved in the climate-controlled vault. Iris broke the brittle wax seal on the first envelope and slid out a thick stack of crisp, densely printed paper. They were municipal bearer bonds, issued by the city in 1985. She stared at the denomination printed in the corner of the top certificate. $100,000. She quickly thumbed through the stack. There had to be at least 50 of them, World. Because they were bearer bonds, they belonged entirely to whoever physically held them. There was no registry, no digital trail. Her grandfather had converted his entire engineering fortune into untraceable paper and buried it out of Gable's reach, accruing decades of interest. It was millions of dollars. But it was the second envelope that made Iris's blood run cold. She pulled out a yellowed legal document titled Master Deed of Trust, Oakhaven Commercial District. Attached was a 1922 land survey, granting James Higgins's company permanent ownership of the underground and foundation rights beneath the entire 3-block downtown district. As Iris read the fine print, she realized the truth. James had owned the land beneath Thomas Gable's empire all along. Every tower, garage, and condominium had been built on his property. If this deed became public, the Gable family could face decades of unpaid land rent and financial ruin. "A brilliant man, your grandfather," a cold voice echoed through the vault chamber. Too bad he was absolutely insane. Iris spun around. Thomas Gable was standing in the doorway of the vault chamber, his expensive suit ruined by the scrapyard mud, his chest heaving. His gun was drawn, pointed directly at Iris's chest. The 2 thugs flanked him, blocking the only exit. "He strung my father along in court for years," Gable spat, stepping slowly onto the marble floor. "He refused to sell, just out of pure spite. My father died of a heart attack, trying to fix the mess that old bastard caused. Hand over the envelopes, Iris, now." Iris's mind raced. She was trapped in a subterranean concrete box, 40 feet below street level, facing 3 armed men. But James Higgins had been a mechanic, an engineer, and above all, a paranoid man who built contingencies into everything he touched. Iris remembered a specific entry in the leather journal she had read in the library. The pneumatic sealing system still works on the primary track. A simple fail-safe. If they come for the vault, they stay in the vault. She glanced past Gable. On the wall just outside the main chamber, there was a heavy red emergency lever designed to seal the vault in the event of a robbery or a flood. "I said, hand them over," Gable yelled, cocking the hammer of his pistol. "Okay, take it," Iris shouted, grabbing the heavy steel drawer and violently hurling it across the marble inspection table. The heavy metal box crashed to the floor between Gable and his men, scattering the millions in bearer bonds across the dusty ground in a chaotic flurry of paper. For one split second, greed overrode logic. Gable's eyes darted down to the fortune scattered at his feet. His men instinctively reached for the falling bonds. It was all the time Iris needed. She lunged forward, diving under the heavy marble table. She slid across the slick floor, slipping right between the legs of the distracted thugs, and scrambled out of the main vault chamber. "Get her!" Gable screamed, realizing what had just happened. Iris jumped to her feet and grabbed the heavy red lever on the wall. She threw her entire body weight onto it. Alarms instantly shrieked, echoing fiercely through the concrete tunnels. Compressed air hissed violently from the ceiling vents. The massive 2-ton steel security door slammed shut with bone-rattling force, sealing perfectly into its heavy iron frame. Gable's furious scream was instantly cut off. The vault was completely airtight. Iris leaned against the cold concrete wall, gasping for air, clutching her canvas backpack tightly to her chest. She had grabbed the original deed and a handful of the bonds before throwing the box. She had won. The shrieking alarms were James's final gift. They were connected directly to the local police precinct. Within 10 minutes, Iris heard the echoing shouts of heavily armed SWAT officers storming down the maintenance tunnels. When the police finally bypassed the security door hours later, they found Thomas Gable and his men huddled in the freezing vault, surrounded by bearer bonds they could no longer claim. Gable was arrested on the spot for armed robbery, breaking and entering, and aggravated assault. 2 weeks later, the front page of the Oakhaven Tribune broke the story of the century. The Gable family empire collapsed overnight as the master deed was validated by the state Supreme Court. Thomas Gable was facing 20 years in federal prison, and the massive real estate conglomerate was forced into immediate liquidation. Iris didn't want to become a ruthless landlord. She sold the land rights back to the city for a staggering 8-figure settlement, ensuring the downtown sector would be preserved and revitalized for the community. On a bright, crisp December morning, Iris stood on the front lawn of 442 Sycamore Drive. The neon orange foreclosure sign was gone. She had bought her childhood home back from the bank, outright, in cash. She turned to look at the driveway. Sitting proudly on the fresh asphalt was the 1973 rusted yellow school bus. She had paid Bill Henderson a small fortune to have it towed and professionally mounted on heavy blocks. She refused to scrap it. It wasn't an eyesore to her. It was a monument to the brilliant, stubborn grandfather who had sacrificed his reputation to ensure she would never have to sleep in the cold again. Iris smiled, running a hand over the rusted yellow paint. Finally safe. Finally home. What would you do if your only inheritance was a rusted piece of junk? Iris's story proves that sometimes the greatest treasures are hidden beneath layers of rust, grime, and misdirection. Never judge a book or a broken-down school bus by its cover. If you enjoyed this real-life tale of betrayal, hidden fortunes, and sweet justice, please smash that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more incredible, untold stories. See you next time.